Welcome to the Advanced Testing in Postman webinar. My name is Joycelyn. I'm the head of developer relations at Postman. I've actually been at Postman for almost, I can't remember quite, it's like 6 or 7 years, which is a really long time. So I've seen how the platform has evolved and also gotten to meet a bunch of the people that are in the audience today. Arlemy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yep, I'm Arlemy. I lead developer advocacy here. I've been at Postman a bit less than 4 years, but even in that amount of time, it's changed a lot. But I think some of the foundation is still there, and we'll see some of that today as well.
And I'm actually excited to do this webinar with Arlemy. Arlemy and I have done several educational sessions together. And so we were thinking, like, how can we make this an advanced API testing session? And a lot of people I guarantee there's a lot of beginners, which is totally fine. However, there's going to be some fundamentals that you'll need to go back and review. But we'll be talking about automation, testing in different environments. This could be different server environments, different Postman interfaces. We'll talk briefly about scripting, using pre-request scripts, assertions, variables, a lot of codeful ways that you can enhance your tests. And then Arlemy will be demonstrating some very complex API workflows. This doesn't have to be something that you take the entire kit and caboodle back with you back to your team, but it's one example of what you could do with API testing in Postman. And then we will be doing kind of lightly on this part, the collaboration features. So Arlemy and myself collaborating with external or internal team member collaborators. So we really tried to beef up this seminar. There are other introductory seminars that if you're curious about contract testing or security testing, we actually have done some of that recently. So we can drop some links if you're interested. But this one's advanced testing, which is kind of a lofty name. So today we will talk about what is testing in Postman. Just to cover that, we won't go into the basics, so don't worry about that. We'll talk about test automation, a few different ways, and then you'll see hands-on a few different ways as well. Recommended testing practices, a couple tips and tricks here and there. And then I think this is actually one of the most important things, but resources. Postman has a ton of resources. There's a lot of community resources as well. So I actually think that's one of the most important parts of this session. And as Arlemy mentioned, ask your questions in real time as you have them. Under the Q&A section of Zoom, we do have a number of expert panelists waiting in the wings to answer your questions, but have a few minutes at the very end reserved for live Q&A. Okay, so first, Arlemy, do you want to quiz our attendees?
Yeah, so we'll have a couple polls throughout the session, but the first one, I believe, is we want to know more about what type of tests you run in Postman. So I'll launch a poll. So now on your screen, you should have been prompted with a little pop-up where you can select. It's a multiple select. So any type of these runs that you run, of these tests, sorry, that you run, tick them, and then we'll be able to see live who we have on the other side of the screen.
I can almost guarantee what this chart is going to look like. And we have like, we should be like racehorse commentators. Manual testing is coming up.
That would actually be a good gift to have, just to see these lines move as we go along. Yeah, I think there's no surprise currently on manual testing being one of the top. So we have we didn't put an option where none of the above actually could have done that. It was probably on our side. We assumed because it was an advanced testing session that people would have some testing under their belt.
And there's a bunch of options on the screen right now. So just scan them all: manual testing, exploratory testing, security and penetration testing, API unit or functional testing, end-to-end integration testing, scenario, CI/CD, negative testing, performance or load testing, and health and status monitoring. And this is not all inclusive, but this was just kind of like let's just see where people have experience.
Okay. Do you think that's long enough for people to vote?
Yes,
okay.
I do.
Let's end the poll and talk about the results.
Yeah, so not too surprising. I would say manual testing is at 80%, and API unit functional testing, you can see the results on your screen right now, is almost at 70%. And everything else from there is probably under 30%. So exploratory testing is the next most popular, 25%. Oh no, there's only 9% of people who do security or penetration testing. Shame. It's
But
okay.
it's good integration testing,
Oh,
34%.
integration,
Yeah.
34%. That's fantastic. Scenario testing, 26%. CI/CD 17, negative testing. Oh, negative testing, 28%. Kind of surprising. Performance 18%, health and status 18%. And it could be that we have, oh, I wish we had recorded people's job functions, because sometimes it's different teams that are responsible for different types of testing. That's kind of interesting. Okay, should we stop sharing?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so this is an oldie but goodie. I call this, what do you call this? A ladder, a pyramid?
Pyramid?
Pyramid.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me sell you my products. So the vast majority, we saw exploratory testing was at 25, but exploratory testing, manual testing are kind of the same thing. There might be a different scenario that you're going into it with. But a lot of times when people say, I'm testing in Postman, they mean that foundational exploration, ad hoc, manual API calls, tweaking parameters, and that kind of thing. And I think there's two big breaking points in this pyramid of going to the top. One is when you write an actual test, and we'll take a look at what that looks like just very briefly. When you actually write a Postman test, that's one breaking point. And then when you chain together, you know how it works, the foundational building blocks, then you can build more complex test suites. And then the other breaking point is once you move from test suites to automation. It's not a human doing it anymore, it's a machine doing it. And you have a lot more reliability and coverage, and then integration testing. So that's a good maturity model, progression ladder, career, like just kind of design, like this is where you should be looking at, even if you aren't there yet. Here's another way to look at it. So a lot of people, 81% of people do manual testing, and that includes exploratory. During development, you might be debugging unexpected behavior. Maybe PMs are doing like user acceptance testing. And then everything beyond that, you have Postman tests. So you have the unit test. Unit test isn't super accurate, but it's the smallest unit of test. That's an awful way of saying it, but they are BDD, behavioral driven development assertions, Chai.js, contract validation, security and penetration testing. Fewer people are doing that. Fuzz testing, putting in unexpected inputs, negative testing, testing the unhappy paths to make sure you're getting the expected responses. And then once you chain together a few different systems, could be APIs, it could be services, it could be different endpoints, you have integration testing. And then performance testing, which in the past we haven't talked about much during webinars, but you might have seen the press announcements. We do have performance testing, and Arlemy will be showing us what that looks like. I believe you're going to be doing load testing, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep. Yeah, that's right.
So this is another way of thinking about it. So if you're thinking about your mental model of how to view Postman tests, there's a couple different ways you could view it. All right. So that first breaking point I said was when you move from exploratory testing or manual testing to actually writing a test in Postman. And this is what that looks like. They are BDD assertions. I expect the response to have this property, to be this property, to have this status code, to be this data type. And so that's the predicate expression using PM expect or PM response to have. That evaluates to a Boolean value. And if it's true, it passes. If any statement or predicate expression is false, it fails. And that is the fundamental building block. If you don't understand that, you definitely need to go back, and we have some other resources where you can get started, but that's all we're going to spend on this slide.
I was just going to ask one question. This could be a bunch of assertions as well, right? For one test.
Yes. So right now, the highlighted PM test status code is 200, has one assertion, PM response to have status 200. But if you wanted to test multiple assertions, you just stack them up. And I don't have a screenshot of that, but maybe we'll see one in the live demo. Yeah, so this is the fundamental building block. You definitely need to know this. And now you either know it now or you don't, but let's move on. Okay. So Arlemy, are you ready to show us the hands-on portion?
I'm just going to reply to one person in the chat, and then actually I can just say it out loud. If you're not seeing the the screen full screen, you can double click on the screen sharing and it should go full screen on your screen and hopefully make it easier for you to see what's happening. So yeah, I'm ready, hopefully. Let's see, let me start sharing my screen. So on the slide that Joyce was showing, there was mention of scenario testing. And that's something that you mentioned in the previous slides as well. I'm going to show a bit more, but that's where I'm going to start with. So a bit of context. Hopefully, most of you are familiar with this view. So that's Postman. I'm in a workspace, so that's a team workspace. And the collection we're going to use today is called Advanced API Testing, and it's available. If you search for it in the search bar there, you'll be able to find it, and you can fork it and start working with it. I've already forked mine, so I'll start working from there. A bunch of stuff in there. First one is the library API reference. So that's an API we have that we use for different like testing scenarios, demos, etc. Contract testing. So I'll go quickly through that, and then we'll talk about Fuzz testing, which is sending a bunch of random stuff through an API to test that still works. So let's start with the scenario. So typically, when you're testing against, let's say, for example, a marketplace, or in that case, a library, you want to check typical scenarios. And in here, I'm checking that I can get a list of books. And so you can see I have my /books endpoint, and I have a test that just checks that the response is 200, and then the response is an array. So if I send this individually, I can get the response there and the results. It all passes. Then I create a new book. And for this one, I just wanted to show something quickly, which is the use of dynamic variables. We call them in Postman. So when you want to test some stuff, instead of always sending the same data, you can use dynamic variables and generate random data to be used. So for here, for example, I'm setting a variable called temp book title to random words, and that's the dynamic variable. And then I'm using that same variable in the body of my request. So the title is always going to be a different one. So if I send that request, same again, something is created and I'm running my tests. So in that case, I only have a single test, which is the status code should be 201. And I'm actually going to save the book title so we can use it for later and check that we can still verify that the book exists. And that's the one that I have next. So in this one, I'm using the get a single book by ID, and I'm checking that it is 200 again, but also that the book title is correct. So if I send this, it fails. And let's see why. Book with ID, no, not found. So let's see what happened. I'll start this one. I'm going to check my collection variables to make sure. Okay, so it did not set the ID here. That's annoying. So maybe I wasn't ready for this demo. Let's see what's happening.
You have a helper suggestion. You're not using an environment. You're using collection variables, right?
Yep, I am using collection variables.
And for your temporary variable, I think I know what it is. Your temporary variable, you're using a local variable, right?
Yeah.
So that won't carry over to the next request. It will only be in a collection run. So just change that to a collection variable.
No, that should be fine.
Okay.
Because this is just set for
the same request.
Yeah, the same request,
Okay.
and I'm using something
Cool.
else. So I'm just going to check the body here. I see why. Okay, so I'm not using the correct URL for this one. So if you bear with me 1 second, I'm going to go here. So we've released a new version of this API, and that's the one I need to use. So I'm just going to go and grab the URL. And we should be back. Okay, so fetch a list of books, works, create a new book, and now I'm missing the API key. Okay, so I've created a new book. It should now be in my variables, and I have the book title, the book ID.
Go to the post really quickly again. So the post is creating a new book. You're getting back a 201 HTTP status code. And then the response object is going to contain the ID as well as the randomly generated title and then some other metadata about the book. Okay.
Yeah. So I can save this in my collection variables. And now I can verify that the book exists. Whew. Let's close. I got 200.
Lichtenstein.
It's got a interesting title, but it's the correct one. Now I can delete the book, so I'm still going to use the same book ID. And I'm getting a 204 no content, so that's typically what a delete endpoint sends. And one of the last check that you always want to do in that type of scenario, you want to make sure that even though the previous request worked, you can double check that the book was correctly deleted. So I'm going to use the same book ID, and this should give me a 404. And you can see in my tests here, I have two. I have one to check that the status is 404. Then I have one that checks that the response actually says the book with my specific ID is not found. So that's a scenario.
And I'm just going to recap that because I think for some people this is very new. So scenario testing, in the folder scenario test, you can literally read the names of the requests and understand what's happening. A couple things. You're replicating what an actual user might be doing, and you're verifying at every step along the way that you're getting the expected response. And then you're also saving information that persists throughout the entire workflow. And Arlemy is going through and clicking and clicking and clicking so that you can see how you're setting and getting variables. But scenario testing is incredibly powerful. That takes a bunch of concepts in Postman and puts them all together.
Yeah, and now I can see how, as Joyce mentioned, right, you want to move from manual testing to automating. So one thing I can do, I can use the collection runner and run all of these at once. And when I say at once, it's one after the other. It's not all at the same time. Otherwise, you want to be able to pass the data. So I'm going to go back to my collection here and click the collection runner at the top there. And I'm only going to select the ones that I'm interested in. So not this one and not this one, and leave it to run manually. So now it's going to run all of this endpoint one by one. I can see all of the tests that passed, which is all of them, and that's good news. If something had happened, I could actually click on it and see what was happening. I can see kind of dive deeper into what happened directly from this window, and it's pretty cool. So that's scenario testing. I want to be conscious of time, so I'm going to move on to the next folder, which is contract testing, and that's also something we've mentioned. So where scenario is testing a lot of endpoints, this one is testing one specific one, but we're going to go deeper into what's matching. So in that case, what I'm doing, I'm defining the schema using JSON schema, and I'm going to define what the response should be like. So in that case, it should be a response type array with a bunch of items. So it's going to be title, author, ID, and all of them have a type as well, right? So there's a year, which is a number. Has the book been checked out? It's yes, no. And when I have that, I can then run a test to check that the response is valid against that schema. So if I send this, I could look manually and just with my own eyes, I can check, oh, okay, is every single one of these items like this? Or I could just go to my test results and realize that it's actually the expected response structure. So you probably see the value here, which is I do not have to scroll through all of these and look at them one by one. I can just define the schema, run it, and same again. You can run that in Postman, and you can have it in your pipeline somewhere. Last one I'm going to
You're using TV4, which is an external library, but I believe there's also AJV. So if you have a preference of schema validation external library, there's choices.
Indeed.
One call out. Ian, who is a panelist here on this webinar, also has an entire webinar on contract testing. Yep,
I got distracted because I'm seeing the number of questions and chat messages go up as I speak, and I'm like, okay, they've got it. So I'm going to move on to the third one for that part of the demo, which is first testing. And same again, we've mentioned it. This one is about, I've got an endpoint. It's got some query parameters, path parameters, or maybe you can send a body. But I want to try and send different things to it. And again, the idea is not to go in there one by one, change that value, and then click send. So one of the things you can use, if you use the collection runner, the thing I was in right before, you can actually feed a data file. So I've got a file on my laptop, which is the big list of naughty strings. Some of you may be aware of that, but it's a list of many words or characters, just things that may make your web service react the way it shouldn't be. So if you're familiar with SQL injection, for example, or maybe just any null characters that you could send to an API. So I've got a whole list of these. So I'm now going to go back to the collection runner and select the file. So it should be right there. So you can actually see it here. It's just a JSON file with a bunch of naughty values. So null, nil, true, false, and there's many of them.
And it's not naughty like cuss words. It's just problematic data, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Good point. So you can see from there, I can see the number of iterations. And I can also preview what it's going to look like. So it's kind of the same thing that we saw. For each iteration, I've got one value. So I can see what's happening. Once I have that, I'm actually going to pass this response for this time. I can run it again. And it's just going to go and send all of them one by one and see what's happening. One thing I did actually, I sent all of the requests in my folder using this instead of just that one. But works the same way anyway. It's going to go through all of the requests you've selected, one for each iteration in the file. So pretty useful when you have, so it can be for a test like this one, first testing. It can be when you want to create tons of records just based on a data file or this type of stuff. Am I missing anything?
Yeah, I've heard of data migration, people like just looping through an external data file just to migrate data. Yeah,
I've actually done that. It's been pretty useful. Okay, so scenario, contract testing, first testing. That was the first part of the demo. Hopefully, not too heavy. You were able to follow along. And if you were not, again, there's a recording and there's going to be a collection, so you can try it for yourself. Hopefully, it's going to be easy as well to understand.
All right. Do you mind if I take over from you, Arlemy?
Yep, go for it.
Okay. All right. So, I mean, I love Arlemy's demos, and it's really an art just to show. We talked about the scenario testing, and we saw dynamic variables, right? That's kind of a tip that I think is really good for one, passing along data, dummy data, but also putting the dynamic variable in the test name, so you have more visibility. You know precisely which book failed when it did fail, right? We also looked at contract testing. We used external libraries there, so you can extend the power of the Postman sandbox. And then we looked at fuzz testing, looping through external data, because there's extra scenarios, there's extra test data, there's data migration, like whatever you want. And so those are a couple tips and tricks for just leveling up your testing. But a couple tips I have for writing better Postman tests, because I run a lot of tests that other people write. And so Arlemy, you mentioned this, grouping multiple assertions. Don't just have one BDD assertion. Stack as many as you can to hit different angles of what you are asserting within a single Postman test. And that allows you to logically organize them so that when something fails, it's something in this cluster of tests. Use messages and console statements. When Arlemy ran the collection runner, all of the tests passed, right? But when it fails, you want more visibility. So whether or not you're using dynamic test names or dynamic messages, and there is in the Postman test syntax, there is a syntax to prepend custom messages. So where you're expecting, you just add an optional parameter so that you can have a little, like, it's not an alert, but a little prepended custom message in your log. So that's a trick to level up your messages for visibility.
And so you can actually use, when you do console log, you have different levels of warning, right? You can do console.1, console.error, and stuff like that to actually use color coding as well in there.
Yeah, and then you can filter by the warns, or like me, you can just ignore all the warns. And then the last tip is to use descriptive or consistent or dynamic test names. I think a lot of us, when we write test names, don't expect to see a batch of like 1,000 and then see like the ones that fail. So that just really gives you a lot more visibility and allows you to narrow down pretty quickly. All right, so just a couple tips from somebody who has some complaints about other people's methods of writing Postman tests. Okay, I think it's time for poll number 2. Arlemy?
All right, let me start this one. So kind of the same way of the first one, we want to, this one is not just about the type of test you do, but it's about how you do it. So you've seen in the first demo that we've done, there's ways to run collections. And that one is, if you've run collections, how do you run them? So I'm going to launch the poll now. And you've got a bunch of options. Again, look at your screen.
Don't hurt my heart. Oh, no.
Hopefully it should be prompted to you and you should be able to answer. Couple of options, plenty of options. And this time we did not forget the I don't run collections. So this is one of them. Collection runner, this is the one that I've shown. Postman CLI Newman, so that's your command line interface runner. Newman in Docker, maybe you can talk about this one because I never use Docker.
Yep. Yeah, that's just a Docker image. That is Newman, that we haven't seen yet. Okay.
CI/CD integration. So if you're using GitHub Actions, Azure pipelines, Jenkins, you name it. Postman API webhooks or Fuzz webhooks, and schedule runs and monitors.
Okay, I probably could have guessed this general distribution, but it still kind of hurts my feelings. But I'm so glad for the people that said they don't run collections. Thank you so much for attending this webinar. You're immediately just going to be a better tester immediately out of the gate.
Okay, do you think that's, oh no, let's give them
No,
5 more seconds.
Too slow.
Okay, I'm going to end the poll and share the results so that everyone can see them as we talk about them.
Yeah, so no surprise here. Well, so first of all, I am kind of surprised, but kudos again. 27% of people attending don't run collections today, but tomorrow and later today, I hope you will give it a try. And then 63% have tried the collection runner that we just saw Arlemy demonstrate. And then from there, it's all downhill. 27% have used Postman CLI or Newman from the command line. That's fantastic. I'm scrolling further down, but 21% have used scheduled runs or monitors running on Postman servers. And then we have 20% using CI/CD integrations. And then 6% tied for Newman in Docker, as well as any kind of webhook, Flows webhooks, Postman API webhooks. Again, this is event triggered to run on Postman Cloud. Interesting.
Yeah, I'm not surprised about that last one. It's not. I mean, Newman in Docker is low, and when I think you released that recently, right? When was that?
No, you've always been able to run. So I created an extension that you can run in Docker Desktop, but I'm actually surprised that Newman and Docker is so low because containerized apps are so. Everyone uses containers. Okay. But are you testing in containers? Yeah. That's the key. You have to like bring it all together.
Everyone but me, apparently.
Well, yeah.
And Postman API webhooks and Flows webhooks. Flows is pretty new, and Postman API webhooks are a bit hidden. So a lot of people don't know about them, but once you talk to them about it, a lot of them jump into it. Okay, let me stop sharing, then we can move on.
Okay, let's move on. All right, so Arlemy already in the first portion of the demonstration showed us a little bit of the collection runner. You kind of stepped through, remember the scenario test, and then ran it in waterfall order using collection runner. And then we looped through the big list of naughty strings JSON file using the collection runner. But there's a couple different ways that you can say you're doing automation, right? So collection runner is the first way. The interface is in the Postman app. And typically when you're doing local development or you're debugging, you might be using collection runner. Postman CLI and Newman, as Arlemy mentioned, is a way to use the collection to run collections from the CLI, but you can also use it in containers. And it's also an NPM package, so you can run it in a script if you're running your own homegrown solution. So the typical use cases for that are part of your CI/CD pipeline if you have one, or just running it anytime on demand. I mean, I bet some people run it from their CLI during development too. So, I mean, it's pretty flexible. Webhooks, it's hidden, but if you're looking for it, you will find it. And this is like, you have this use case, you need a webhook. Yes, Postman has webhooks. And again, that's to run on Postman servers with an event-based trigger. And there's a bunch of integrations that will work with webhooks. And so that's how you can hook together third-party solutions with Postman collection runs. And then the last one is scheduled runs. And if you had an eagle eye, you might have spotted it during Arlemi's collection run demo, but scheduled runs and monitors are behind the scenes, kind of the same thing, but psychologically it's different. One is scheduling runs to run on Postman Cloud, and one is monitoring the health or status of something. And again, those are on Postman servers. So the last two options there for test automation run on Postman servers, and then the first two run locally or on the machine of your choice. Gosh, that's a lot of automation, but judging by the distribution of our poll, we needed this slide. Okay,
Yep.
You ready for this, Arlemi?
Is it me again?
Yeah. You ready to show us some more automation besides collection runner?
Okay. Are we taking bets on chances this demo is going to fail?
100%.
Okay, cool. So tons of automations, and I'm going to try to show most of them. Again, I'll look at the time as I go and see like if I can go deeper or if I like need to move on to the next one. But yeah, I've shown the collection runner using this collection, the advanced API testing. Now I'm going to move on to another one, contract testing. So you can see in this workspace, I actually have a bunch of collections. I've not created these ones. We have this thing called workspace templates. So when you create a new workspace, you're now prompted with templates, and one of them is API testing. So if you select that, all of these collections are going to be there. They all have a bunch of documentation to tell you how to get started with it. And this one is a pretty simple one. 3 endpoints, couple tests to see how it works.
Before you go on, can you show us where you get the templates?
So you would need to create a new workspace in here. And then once you have your new workspace.
Oh, it's an entire workspace of
workspace template.
I see.
Here at the top, you've got this API testing. So you can like select API testing and it's going to just generate everything for you. So move back to this one. So yeah, contract testing collection, 3 endpoints, all with a bunch of tests. But it all starts from the collection runner. And I've talked about getting to the collection runner from here. You can also access it from the view more actions of your collection, and then you should have an option for run collections. If I click on this, I've got the same window. We've been through the run manually, so you should be kind of familiar with this one now. But you can see here, you've got 2 more options. One of them is schedule runs, and schedule runs, well, there's a description there, but also I think the name kind of gives it away, is on a schedule, on a cron job, you'll periodically run your collection on the Postman Cloud. So I can give that schedule a name. It's going to be my contract testing schedule. And then you've got a run frequency. So that frequency, you may have different availabilities based on your pricing plan, but I'll keep it to every hour. And I'm not going to keep you here for an hour just so we see, I'll run it manually, but at least you see the UI. And then you've got a couple of options. So do I want to use an environment? Do I want to use a data file? Like we did with Fuzz testing, and who should get the notifications if something fails? It's probably going to be me. So I'll click run, and now I can run it manually, so we don't have to wait. And we've got this UI, and every time there's a new run, so I'm going to run it a couple of times manually just so you see how it will look. Every time there's a new run, you've got a new column here with your different runs. Apparently, this one is taking a bit of time. I think it's probably not liking that. I sent it that many requests, and you'll get these test results, the ones that have passed, fail. You can also investigate the console log if anything happened and you want to kind of debug what's happening. And you could have different schedules for your collection. And then once you have the different ones, you can actually find them from your collection here. And then there's a runs tab there. So you can see the batch runs, the schedule runs, etc. So that's one. This is schedule runs on the cron job, just running my collection. Now let's move back to the collection runner window and move on to the third item, which is how to automate it using CLI. So we mentioned Newman and Postman CLI. Newman is an open source project that is maintained by the community. The Postman CLI is one that is maintained by Postman. So that's the one I'm going to demo here. And the other reason for which I'm going to demo this one is that it actually generates the code for you, or like the commands for you. So you can see run on Postman CLI, and from there, I'm going to generate an API key. It's going to be generate key. I already have too many keys. Okay.
Show us all of your keys.
I'm going to delete this one. Please do not look.
No one's looking.
Okay, so I've got my key. It's now inserted into my code, and I can copy this and move on to my terminal and paste that command. So you can see it's using the Postman CLI. So it's already pre-installed. I'm not going to go through the installation on my machine. It's using the login command using the API key. So now it's going to know what account to pull the collections from, and then it's going to run the collection that has this ID. So if I enter that, and I'm just going to move back to the top so we can see what happened. Logged me in using my API key, and then started going through all of the endpoints, test response, check for valid query params, and check for valid form data. And I can also see this little table overview of what happened, number of tests that were executed, the ones that failed, the run durations, etc. And that's still a bit manual. It's just me going in there, pasting it. But you can imagine how you could have that command as part of maybe your CI/CD. And that's when we move on to the next one.
Well, actually, can you go back one more second?
Yeah.
I mean, Arlemy already pointed out the fundamental differences between Newman and Postman CLI, like open source, community support, yada, yada. But if you scroll up to the top and show us your API key again, there is a slight difference in behavior too. So a lot of times when people are using Newman, they're running a local exported JSON file of the collection, or they're using the Postman API with their API key stuffed in, accessing it via URL. And so that's really interesting that the Postman CLI is logging you in so that you have access to the most recent version of any collection you have saved. And that's important because a lot of people say, should I export a collection or should I access the collection via URL? And almost always I'll say, hey, if it's baked, that collection, that API, nothing's happening, you can use a JSON file, but really you do want to get the most recent up-to-date version.
Yep. So when you use an API key like this, publicly, you want to go back to your settings and delete the API key straight away, just in case. And so I mentioned you could run it as part of your CI/CD pipeline. And you may have noticed when I clicked on automate runs, there's this little option at the bottom, which if I click on it, will actually generate like the command preview for different CI/CD providers. So I can select, I mentioned Azure Pipelines, Jenkins, Circle CI. If I wanted to work in GitHub Actions, I can now get that command, put it in my GitHub Actions, and whenever I have my pipeline that's triggered there, is going to run the collection as part of the pipeline. Not going to be doing this now because we have more to demo. But if you're using any of these, we generate the comments for you. If you have a different CI/CD pipeline, you can always like install the Postman CLI yourself or use Newman in your comments anyway.
That's really helpful.
Yeah, I like demos where I just have to copy paste things.
Yeah.
It's very, very helpful to me. So that's the different options that we also saw in Joyce's table. One of the things she did mention at the start as well was performance testing.
Ooh, you're going to show performance testing?
Yeah, so performance testing, if you've followed the Postman blog, is released or it's pre-released. It's on early access, but turns out I have it enabled on one of my accounts. So here's another account that I'm on, and I have another collection, which is regression testing. The collection itself doesn't matter. I'm just going to talk about what I've done to it. The load testing or performance testing that we have will obviously collect the error rate. And an error is a status code that is not 200. So what I've done, I've just edited that endpoint to get a 404, and this will always give me a 404 not found, just so we have some error rate when I do the load testing. So now that the context is set up, let's go back to collection runner. And now you should see a little difference at the top. I have two tabs, one for functional testing and one for performance testing. So if I switch to this one, I have a bunch of things I can configure. So the number of virtual users that should be hitting the endpoints at the same time, the length of my test duration, I could keep it to 2 or 3, and the load profile. So I have 20 virtual users. Do I want them all to come in and start hitting my API at the same time? Or do I want them to ramp up? So first 1 user, then 2 users, then 3 users. And this is divided by the length of the test duration. I'm going to keep it 20 from the start because it gives better lines and it's better to look at. So I'll start it. It's going to prepare to run. And now, if all goes well, I should start seeing all of my data come in as the performance testing is happening. So a couple of things in here. You can see the number of requests that are being sent live, the number of requests per second, response time, and the error rate. So I have one of my 5 endpoints that actually is failing. So it's not surprising that we have 20% of error rate, or like around 20%. And all of this is shown on there. So that gray line at the top is the number of virtual users. I could remove that because it's not ramping up, so it's always going to be steady. I have the number of requests per second, that's the yellow one. You can also hide that. The average response time in milliseconds, and you can see there on the right-hand side. And then last but not least, the error rate. Again, should be pretty consistent, 20% overall. And that's the basics of performance testing in Postman. And then you have this table that shows you per endpoint what's happening. So obviously, this one will get a 100% error rate, and all the other ones have 0%. So I'll stop it there. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, in the runs overview of my collection, there's now a new tab for performance runs, and I can access the previous performance runs that I've run as well.
You have a lot of oohs and ahs from the audience. I think that's super, super nifty. How do you access the performance tab?
So from the collection runner. So again, you can run collection from here or from the run collection button there at the collection level. There's a performance tab right there. So again, you might not see that in your app, and that's normal because you need to get access to it first. There's going to be a link that is shared to, let me actually show you. If you go on, I don't know if we have the link handy in the panelist, but if not, you can go to the blog, search for performance. And then the first one is get early access to Postman API performance testing. And while I have it, I'm just going to spam it in the chat because why not? There we go. Cool. I think that's it. There was one more thing. So Joyce, you tell me. One thing we mentioned was webhooks.
Yeah. Just show it to us. Show it to us. Yes.
Okay. So there was 2 options for webhooks. One of them is the monitor webhooks. So if you have a monitor created, you can use the Postman API to create a webhook endpoint that's going to trigger your monitor. And the monitor, again, looks a lot like your schedule runs. So it's going to be something like this, and you can trigger it from there. I'm not going to demo this one because I think there's a better one. And when I say better, it's just easier to demo. But I think a lot of you might not have heard about it as well. So flows, which is our low-code, no-code way to create workflows in Postman. I'm going to create a new flow, and I'm going to keep it super simple. So I've got a start, so that's where my flow starts getting triggered, and I can add a send request endpoint. And from there, I'm just going to go and check one of my requests from the collection. What can we do with this? We put this access in log, and that's pretty much it. It's a very simple flow, but you can imagine how you could pair up like plenty of APIs, create workflows in there.
We do have a separate webinar on flows.
Yeah, so that's why I'm not going to spend too much time. But one of the things that's there at the top is deploy. So if I do this, I'm getting a webhook URL there. And I can, well, if only there was a tool from which I could send requests, right? So I'm going to send a request to that endpoint. And this triggers a run of the flow that I have here. I can see the live log, so I can actually see it's been triggered. I can see what happened. And there's, again, this could be a flow for many things. I know my UI is getting a bit crowded there. Let me close a bit stuff. So yeah, it could be for triggering the creation of something, for triggering a scenario like we had before. You can imagine the things you can create there. And if you can't imagine anything, there's this workspace that you may want to have a look at, which is called Bring Postman Flows, with tons of examples of things you can do with Postman Flows. But yeah, you can then deploy it, and you get this little webhook endpoint that you can trigger from anywhere.
Yeah, and Flows requires you to sign up for. Do you need early access for this one? No. It's if people don't see it under their on their sidebar.
So there's a couple of things for Flows, and not only for Flows, but if you're missing some things in your sidebar here compared to what I have in my UI, it's because we've released this little configure sidebar tooltip now, or like tool, where you can select what you want to show or not, just so you can like be in charge of what you want to show in your workspace. The other thing is, I believe one plan, which may be the basic plan, doesn't have access to Flows. But if you're on the free tier, you have access to Flows. If you do not see it, you can always chat to us on the community forum, which is community.postman.com, and we'll help you get access to it. But
yeah, and so the Flows webhook is just one where, hey, if you happen to be working with Flows, somebody thought, hey, is there a way to trigger this flow? Like when I'm working in a different app or something? Yes, there is. And if you have the question, is there a way to do this thing? The 6% of people who are currently using webhooks ask that question. It's not because Postman was like in your face about use our webhooks. So now's your chance to ask in the Q&A section, is there an opportunity to do this? Or how do you do this?
Yeah, I think is there a way to trigger that flows from somewhere else is the one question I've gotten every single time I've demoed Flows until we actually released it.
Yeah.
But yeah, people were interested in that. Okay, so I think that's it for my demo. What have we seen? We've seen all of the ways to run collections that are accessible from here, all the way to run on CI/CD. We had a look at performance testing as well, passing by the Postman CLI in your terminal, and then we just had a quick run through Flows and Flows webhooks.
And all of the ways of automation, I think everything that you've showed so far is available on the free plan. There are some rate limits when it comes to, I think, Collection Runner. And then, as Arlemy mentioned, Flows is not available on one of the plans. But everything else you should be able to try out, I believe. There's
going to be, if we look at this one, there's a limit on the number of collection runs, manual collection runs you can do. There's a different limit for the scheduled runs and automated runs via CLI, because that's using the Postman API rather than the manual runs. And then for the flows, you'll have a limit of the number of users that can create flows, I believe.
Okay.
I think that's the overview of it.
Can I take back over?
Yep.
Okay, let me quickly recap Arlemy's recap. So here's the two models that we saw earlier. One is the API testing progression ladder, like one schema in your mind. I shouldn't use the word schema. One way of thinking about API testing. Arlemy showed us how to do exploratory and manual API calls, did a little bit of debugging with looking at live debugging with looking at the console and the collection run results. We looked at BDD assertions, contract validation using TV4, I believe, fuzz testing with the big list of naughty strings, with the scenario with the bookstore checking at every point along the way. And then we saw a sneak peek of the load testing, which I think is always kind of fun. And then a couple different ways of doing test automation. I think we definitely looked at Collection Runner several times. We saw Postman CLI, and then we looked at flows, webhooks running on Postman Cloud. And then we looked at scheduled runs, I believe, also running on Postman Cloud. So there's a lot of different types of testing that you could be doing and a lot of different ways that you could do automation. And you can choose your own adventure. And one more mental model that you can have, another way to think about testing, is if you've attended any webinar of Postman's, you've seen this picture 1,000 times. So this is the API producer lifecycle that starts with define, design, develop, test, and so forth, all the way through the API producer lifecycle. And here's just one way you could consider. This is not the demo that Arlemy did today, but you could, during define and design, use mock servers. Postman has mock servers to enable parallel development. Maybe you want to write tests at the same time that the development is developing the interface. You can write consumer-driven contract tests. And then you can make your manual calls, debug your unexpected behavior like Arlemy did live today. You can write actual Postman tests, which are BDD assertions. And once you know that fundamental building block, you can replicate complex user journeys. You could do some penetration testing. Arlemy mentioned SQL injections or other OWASP vulnerabilities. We have an entire webinar on security testing. And then once you deploy, we saw several ways to deploy. You can run on your CI/CD pipeline. You can run on Postman clouds, and we saw a sneak peek at the performance testing. And then on the monitoring side, that's scheduled runs, but psychologically, you can monitor the health and status. And then I think one thing we didn't see is integration with incident response tools, which I believe is rate limited for certain paid plans, or is limited in the amount of integrations you can have for incident response. And then debugging with tracing and logs. So this is another model that you might have, and there's many ways to customize it. But something the CEO of Postman, Abhinav Asana, said to me really early in my career at Postman was that stuck with me is that Postman is an unopinionated tool. There's a lot of ways that you can swap in and out different pieces and different tooling and have different integrations. It's very flexible and it's modular, so you can customize it to your own workflow. But more and more, there's so many people using Postman. I think we're at 25 million right now, Arlemy. Yeah, it's unbelievable. And people are asking for, no, just tell me exactly what to do, right? Just tell me what to do and then I'll do it. And so Arlemy showed you one way. This screen right here is another way, but I do want to point out it's unopinionated and it's flexible. So you do you. But if you don't know what you don't know, right? This is one of the reasons why you sign up for this webinar. There is, maybe we could drop a link to this, a self-assessment. And I would say, don't even do this on your own. Do this as a group. Take this to your team and do a group assessment and say, what do we currently do today? And what should we be doing? Use this as a conversation starter so that you can increase your test coverage. We took a look at fuzz testing, negative testing. Kudos to a number of people here who are doing negative testing, looping through a data file, external, just feeding in entropy. I don't know if that's the right word. Chaos, feeding in chaos, right? Let's do different types of testing to build more resiliency. Okay, so do you want to recap everything that we've talked about today, Arlemy?
I'll try, and then you can probably fill in the gaps. But yeah, what we learned today, or what hopefully most of you learned today, is the different types of testing you can run in Postman. But I think you learned about different types of testing that exist in general, and then we kind of showed you some of them in Postman. And this is, again, negative testing, scenario testing, integration testing. Now I already forgot the ones I said in the one I forgot, but plenty of testing types. Different ways to do automation testing in Postman. So again, like scheduled runners, automate runs via CLI, CI/CD, etc. How to test complex API workflows. So that was that example that I gave at the start with the book library. You know, you create a book, you get the list of books, you create a new book, you check that it exists, you delete the book, you check that it doesn't exist anymore. This type of stuff, and also like passing data from one request to the other, doing some workflow manipulation based, like conditional workflows, etc. And then we talked about the Postman collaboration feature to manage test suites, share results with team members. We didn't go in depth into that, but I did mention at the start we were in a team workspace. In that context, everyone has access to that, and everyone can collaborate on these collections, and schedule runners, overview and monitors, etc., etc. Did I forget something? No. Okay. So a few things to look forward to. Performance testing, this one we've kind of teased it, but you can look forward to that. That's one. One that you may not be aware of, but again, if you scroll through our blog, so blog.postman.com, it's BuzzBot. So we've just started a trial with this. So again, early access, you can get access to that. It's an AI assistant in Postman. So for now, what it does, you may have seen some of the tests that we've written for some requests. You now have the way to do natural language generating tests. So you just say, generate tests for that request that check that a book has been created. It's going to generate the related test. I believe could generate like some type of contract testing, etc. The way we saw it as well. And I see some people in the chat saying that they've tried it already and it's pretty rad. So it's good feedback. VS Code extension just been released about a couple of weeks. So if you go in the VS Code marketplace and search for Postman, you'll now see the VS Code extension. For now, it allows you to send requests in HTTP, gRPC, and WebSocket requests because it's the first iteration. But we're coming up with collections, history, etc. So you can expect like a very nice seamless integration with Postman, but directly from VS Code. So if that's where you work in, it should make your like workflow easier and more. There's maybe more protocols come in. I don't know. Just keep coming to the webinars and you'll see.
Yes, I see. Nothing tickles my fancy lately like AI. Yeah, Postbot is a big hit. And did you want to go over additional resources as well?
No, you can go.
Okay. So I think for any testing webinar that we do, those first two are always in the additional resources that you need to know. Test Examples in Postman is a public workspace that has a ton of code samples. So if you're like, contract testing, how do I do that? Or how do I test this type of property? You can search for it and see like security testing examples, lots and lots of code samples. 15 Days of Postman for Testers was, it's intermediate/advanced. So it's not a beginner testing challenge, but it's 15 days of Postman for testers. Advanced API debugging, we have a couple webinars that we've shouted out, and I see that they've posted the link in the chat. We had Intro to Security Testing. We have Continuous Quality from Neil Studd. We have Contract Testing with Ian Douglas. And this is another one that I want to give a shout out for. Advanced API Debugging was with you and me, Arlemy. It was kind of an oldie, but a goodie. It really tells you about, something's not going right. How do I find more visibility and what are the best practices for digging a little bit deeper? And that last one is Quick Start. So hands-on tutorials. I gave a shout out for Neil Studd's continuous quality webinar that we did a while back, but there is hands-on tutorials that you can search by for tests or for advanced or for beginner getting started and so forth. You can filter on different types of hands-on tutorials. All right, lots and lots of resources.
Survey?
Survey?
Survey, please survey. Yeah, so at the start I mentioned how we're going to send you a link to a survey. So you can give us your feedback. We've seen some of your feedback in the chat, but there's probably more questions in there. Was it too short, too long, too fast?
I don't actually care about that. I want you guys to tell us, what do you want to hear about next? Because almost all the good webinars that we do is people asking, hey, can you do contract testing? Can you do like this? Security, more security, something like that. Please fill out the survey. Let me drop a link. Oh, there it is. It's in the chat. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, please fill it in. Please tell us if we've done great. Anyway, I do care. You know, it's always good.
Oh, yeah.
Confirmation.
Tell Arlemy what a great job those demos were.
And we will be sharing this anyway. The link will be in the email that is gonna come afterwards in your inbox.
So yeah, definitely fill out the survey. And I will say for Q&A, we don't have any more time for live Q&A. We answered some real time as we were going. And I see that we have a number of unanswered questions. So as Ian is asking people to do in the chat, please do ask your questions on our community forum, community.postman.com. And we'll try to get to them. Tons of questions. Thank you so much to the panelists for answering so many questions. I knew there was testers are notorious for asking their questions. I knew there would be some good questions. And so with that, Arlemy, do you have any closing sentiments for us?
No. Thank you for joining. Hopefully we'll see you either on the community forum or at one of our events coming up.
Yes, thank you very much for joining, and we look forward to seeing you in the next one. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Arlemy. Goodbye.